Former President Donald Trump would not even think of preemptively pardoning himself before leaving office in 2021. At least that's what he told NBC anchor of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, in an interview set to air this coming Sunday. Let's watch.
The last thing I'd ever do is give myself a pardon. I could have given myself a pardon. I was told by some people that these are sick lunatics that I'm dealing with. Give yourself a pardon. Your life will be a lot easier. I said I would never give myself a pardon.
Even if you were reelected in this moment?
Well, I think it's very unlikely. What did I do wrong? I didn't do anything wrong.
Trump, who's facing 91 felony charges, chalked it up to nothing more than a witch hunt.
Trump also sat down with former Fox anchor Megyn Kelly in her Sirius XM show, in which she pressed him on classified documents that were in his possession after he left the Oval Office. He contended being protected by the Presidential Records Act. Let's listen.
What were you waving around in that meeting? Because it certainly sounds like
I'm not going to talk to you about
plan.
that because that's already been, I think, very substantiated, and there's no problem with it.
It hasn't been substantiated. Jack Smith says
Megyn,
it was
let
the
me just
attack
tell you.
plan.
Let me
and you told Brett Barrett.
Let me tell you. Here we go again. I'm covered by the Presidential Records Act. I'm allowed to do what I want to do. I'm allowed to have documents.
So I don't know if his text messages reflect that same line of thinking where he said, I guess it's too late. You know, we didn't declassify them. So this is a tough issue for him because he keeps talking about it with the press. I don't know. I think a smarter decision legally would be whenever it's brought up, you know, this is a pending legal matter. I'm not going to talk about it. But I think maybe some people would suggest that means he's guilty. So it puts him in a tough position. But hearing him constantly go back and forth on this one issue makes me feel like it might not go his way in a court of law if all this stuff is admissible.
It definitely would be smarter to maybe just stop talking about it and let the legal team handle it. And this is a lot of people's frustration with Trump, is that he does not really have message discipline. He kind of just says whatever's at top of mind. And it's a love and hate thing, right? Because people loved it in 2016 when he was willing to say the quiet part out loud on issues like immigration and workers' rights and reshoring American manufacturing. But when he gets into other issues that potentially damage and distract from those messages, it starts to get incredibly frustrating. And in this case, we're talking about indictments, charges, things that could possibly land him in prison. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not as much as the Democrats do. But in this case, when he's talking about this Iran document, there's so many moving parts legally here. For one, this document was not brought in the original round of the 31 charges from Jack Smith in the documents case. And it was suggested to CBS when they ran a report on that it was because the DOJ could not find that document or they didn't have access to it. All they had was the clip of Trump talking about waving something around in front of people and admitting apparently that he had the opportunity to declassify whatever it was in his hand, but that he didn't. He since told Fox News' Brett Baer that it was simply a collection of news clippings and news articles. And then Jack Smith brings the new level of charges, including an additional indictment on the Iran document. So did they find it between the first round and now? It's kind of unclear. But what's interesting is that in the indictment, they refer to it as a presentation as opposed to a document or a plan, because the suggestion has been that this was actual war plans drawn up in case the United States were to go to war with Iran, and now it's being referred to as a presentation. So I'm curious to know exactly what that means and how this will come about in terms of the evidence when we actually get into the trial here.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see him go back and forth with Megyn Kelly on a lot of things that went down during his presidency and immediately afterwards. You have a lot of Fox News hosts that I think used to be more on Trump's side than they are now. Maybe the lawsuit facing Fox News had something to do with it. But seeing Megyn Kelly on a Sirius XM show sit down with Donald Trump, seeing Tucker Carlson sit down with an independent interview, it seems to me that they're getting more into the meat of things than they were in traditional media. And so I think that's good to see Trump actually ask some hard questions by Megyn Kelly here.
Yeah, I will say Trump has never been afraid of talking to unfriendly media. Megyn Kelly and him, of course, notoriously went at it in one of the debates in 2015, where he gave that line about blood coming out of her whatever. They've since sort of rekindled their relationship, I guess you could say. They're on friendlier terms now, but that doesn't mean that she's going to sit there and give him a softball interview either. That's just not who Megyn Kelly is. If anything, I think Tucker maybe is a little friendlier, but even then, these people are approaching Trump from the right. They're looking at him and saying, whatever you did wasn't conservative enough. Like on the Fauci question, for example, Megyn Kelly grilled Trump on his handling of COVID while commander-in-chief, which he applauded himself for, but claims he got no kudos for. Let's watch.
You know, they appreciated what I did with the economy. I got a lot of good marks on economy. I got a lot of good marks on a lot of things. Rebuilding the military, getting rid of ISIS, the biggest tax cuts in history.
Supreme Court.
I never got, I think, the credit that I deserve on COVID.
Asked why he failed to fire then White House Chief Medical Advisor Anthony Fauci and instead elevated him to be the face of the coronavirus task force, this is what he said.
You made him a star. You made him a star. This is the criticism of you, that you made him the face of the White House coronavirus task
You think so?
force, that he was out at every presser, that he was running herd for the administration on COVID, and that you actually gave him a presidential commendation before you left office. Wouldn't you like a do-over on that?
I don't know who gave him the commendation. I really don't know who gave him the commendation.
Presidential commendation. One went out to Mark
Somebody
Miller, too.
probably.
On his last day in office, Trump did indeed award presidential commendation to Fauci for his efforts on Operation Warp Speed to get those COVID vaccinations out. So I think Trump does a few things that are very interesting that I think a lot of presidents do, but he's very transparent about it, where when asked about the deficit and government spending, when Biden was in office, he says things like the debt is out of control. They absolutely have to cut spending and manage the budget differently. But when he was in office, he was very quick to increase the national deficit and very quick to authorize government spending and corporate tax cuts. And when asked about this, he simply said, well, that was different because I was president then.
Kind of an iconic
is
line, to be
Fauci only a
honest.
bad guy? What was that?
Kind of iconic, to be honest.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a funny approach because there are a lot of people in public office that do the exact same thing but are not as transparent about it, where they criticize the opposition for doing something they've done. But I think in the case of Anthony Fauci, I don't know, is he only a bad guy when Biden is president? It was a good question from Megyn Kelly.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of the things that, of course, differentiates him and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. They sort of got into it over that, where Trump claimed that DeSantis has been lying about his COVID record, that Florida was shut down for a month, as Megyn Kelly pointed out, which was a little bit longer than some other states like Georgia and South Dakota. But on the whole, I think most people would agree that DeSantis handled COVID better than Donald Trump, at least from a conservative perspective. And Trump is kind of trying to rewrite history. But what Trump did, I think, was smart, was that in the beginning of the campaign, before DeSantis even announced, he brought up the COVID issue and started raising these questions about DeSantis's record, which I think kind of neutered that issue in a lot of ways. It's good, though, to see Megyn Kelly bringing it up again, because I think people would like to hear Trump say, yeah, I kind of got this one a little bit wrong, and if it happened again, I would do it differently. But that's not really something that Trump has shown he's capable of doing. I also want to give myself credit because I was, I think, the first person in media to ask Trump why he did not fire Dr. Anthony Fauci. This was back in October of 2021. And this is what he told me then. He said, well, he's been there for 40 years or something. He's like a fixture. And I basically did, for the most part, the opposite of what he was saying. He was totally against masks, and then he became a radical masker. And I was very strongly opposed to masks. He was very much against closing the country to China and to Europe. And I very, very early did both. And he will admit that we saved thousands and thousands of lives doing that. And so he's kind of taken this approach several times since, where he claims, well, I couldn't fire him because he had been there for so long, he was a bureaucrat, or I couldn't fire him because I would have taken too much flack from the media. And it just doesn't pass muster, because he was more than willing to fire people like Jim Comey. He was actually seeking to reform the ability to fire longtime government officials and employees in his second term if he were to win. And he is someone who is constantly receiving 90 to 95% negative media coverage. So the idea that he would suddenly care about that when it came to Dr. Fauci is pretty odd.
Yeah, it's odd the way that DeSantis and Trump handled the COVID issue, because at the very beginning, Trump was for the vaccine, calling it the Trump vaccine. At the beginning, I went into Florida within the first 2 months of the COVID pandemic, and I had gotten stopped at the border to Florida and had gotten checked up by, I don't know, Florida state officials, not sure what department they were in. They had flashlights. The vehicles went through a series of tents. You had your temperature taken. You had to fill out a series of paperwork. You had to show that you didn't test positive for COVID and sign a document to promise that there wasn't a chance you had COVID-19 or contact with someone who did. It was a really lengthy process. I passed through every state between New York and Florida was the only one where I encountered that under the DeSantis governorship. And so I think the way that they've switched up according to what the Republican base would like their COVID response to be is really interesting to me. Because on the one hand, you say, okay, this was an elected official meant to represent the people. They've changed how they're governing according to what public opinion is. But was it majority public opinion? Was it just their base of voters? That's another concern there. But to me, the switch up feels dishonest. And while it's iconic of Trump to, say it's fine when he's in office and it's not fine when other people do it, is it good policy making? Is it what we really need as a country? And I'm kind of on the side of no there.
I do think Trump has a point when he says, or sort of justifies his initial handling of COVID by saying, nobody knows what it was. The government officials who were in charge of the public health response didn't even really know how this thing was spreading or what it was. I think that's a fair criticism. There were a lot of people, especially on the conservative side, who initially said, yes, we should do the 15 days or whatever. But once we got beyond that, it was too much. And so he does have a point on that fact, I think. We'll be back with more Rising after this.